UC Berkeley. The very name is synonymous with the American free speech movement. But now, that same ground is a federal crime scene. The Department of Justice has stepped in, treating a recent campus protest not as some local scuffle, but as a severe civil rights violation. There are allegations of a politically motivated cover-up, one protected by university administrators and even parts of the media, triggered by shocking violence against conservative students. What evidence was so undeniable that it forced the federal government's hand? Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. Okay, let's get right into this. The event itself was a memorial for Charlie Kirk. The speaker was the actor and comedian Rob Schneider. And the reports we've analyzed, they don't describe a situation that slowly got out of hand. They paint a picture of immediate, overwhelming chaos.
That's exactly right. It wasn't a slow burn at all. What we're seeing described is what observers on the ground called a full-blown meltdown from the very start.
A meltdown.
Yes. And this is key. It doesn't seem to be the typical sort of disorganized energy you might see at a college protest. The details really suggest a significant degree of premeditation and intent to obstruct. And that right there is why this escalated beyond the campus police. It's why it attracted such serious outside scrutiny.
So walk us through that. What did it actually look like on the ground right before the event was even supposed to begin? What were those first signs that this was?
Well, more than just a protest.
The atmosphere was one of pure physical antagonism. Fistfights were breaking out before the doors to the venue even opened.
Before they even opened.
Exactly. People trying to attend weren't just being shouted at or debated with. They were being physically blocked from entering the building. We're talking about masked agitators swarming the entrances, creating a human blockade.
And what about the security measures? Weren't there barricades?
There were. But the effort to block the doors was so intense, so forceful, that the physical security barriers, the metal ones they put up for crowd control, they were actually collapsing under the sheer pressure of the mob. Wow. So the crowd's force was literally overwhelming the planned security. That says a lot.
It says everything. And this is where the university's official story, their narrative, just immediately collides with the reality of the situation. According to the reports, the administration tried to label this disaster as just, campus tension.
Campus tension.
Yes. And that failed spectacularly. It was an impossible position to defend. The level of violence, and more importantly, the clear intent to silence constitutionally protected speech. It made that description sound, frankly, absurd.
The sources we looked at argue this was the moment Berkeley's legacy kind of inverted itself, that the birthplace of free speech had become its opposite.
It's a profound symbolic reversal, isn't it? When an institution that famous for free expression is perceived to be enabling, or at the very least allowing, the suppression of ideas through physical violence, well, then it transforms. It goes from being a bastion of intellectual freedom to, as one observer put it, the headquarters of censorship.
And that's what sets the stage for the federal government.
Precisely. The gravity of it all, the clear political targeting, it meant that the usual way of handling these things, downplaying it locally, that just wasn't going to work this time.
Which brings us directly to that federal framing. Why did this jump from a campus issue straight to the Department of Justice? I mean, that's a huge leap. It separates this from, thousands of other campus scuffles.
It is a huge leap. And it's triggered when an incident stops being about, say, simple assault and starts implicating federal civil rights protections. The reports we analyzed highlight two conditions that were allegedly met here. First, you have serious allegations of coordinated violence. This might have involved non-local, even out-of-state agitators, which suggests a conspiracy to violate rights that crosses state lines.
Okay, so that's one part, the coordination.
Right. And the second, and this is the most decisive part, is that the action taken was explicitly aimed at shutting down constitutionally protected speech. And it was successful.
So the DOJ is less focused on, say, a misdemeanor punch and more on the intent behind it all. The goal was to deny civil liberties.
Exactly. When you have students being physically assaulted, harassed, and blocked from attending a lawful, peaceful event simply because of their political beliefs, that's no longer just a campus matter. That crosses the threshold into a federal civil rights violation.
Sure. And the reports suggest that for years, universities have gotten used to a different approach.
Oh, absolutely. The sources note that campus authorities were accustomed to relying on what they called sympathetic local prosecutors. The idea was to just let these incidents fade away through administrative inertia.
Yeah.
But the legal framework being applied now, especially under the administration change detailed in the reports, is completely different.
Oh, so.
Politically motivated violence, especially against attendees of conservative events, is now being treated as a high-priority federal issue. And that represents a major, major shift in accountability that university administrators, well, they just might not have been prepared for.
And that lack of preparation, that old way of thinking, it seems to have led them directly into these allegations of a cover-up. The sources suggest that once the violence subsided, the first priority for the university administrators and even some campus police was pure damage control.
Right. Not transparency, damage control.
Exactly. They allegedly tried to, quote, bury the federal level violations under a nothing to see here shrug. The assumption seems to have been that if they could just manage the initial news cycle, control the optics, the federal implications would just disappear.
Politically motivated strategy, it seems.
According to the reports, yes. And it wasn't just about internal statements. The role of external media was apparently critical to this effort.
So how were local news outlets allegedly involved in this attempt at minimization?
The reports we've seen point to very specific instances. Local affiliates, including some CBS channels, are accused of actively helping to control the narrative. While describing what was clearly a riot, they reportedly called it a very lively scene.
A lively scene.
Yes. But the deeper allegation, the more concerning one, is about active editing. They're accused of, quote, quietly trimming away every punch, shove, and racial taunt from what they broadcasted. Just think about the implications of that. If your job is to report the news, why would you remove the most newsworthy parts? The violence.
It suggests the goal wasn't reporting.
The observers cited in the reports argue the goal was to gaslight an entire nation, to basically tell the public, hey, that extreme violence you saw on your phone, recorded by citizens, that didn't really happen. It was just a vibrant protest. Trust our edited, sanitized version.
They were trying to maintain what the sources call the mostly peaceful shield.
A shield that shattered almost immediately.
And it shattered because that strategy relies entirely on controlling the flow of information. In today's world, with HD cameras in every single pocket, that's a fundamentally flawed premise. This shield just couldn't hold.
Because of independent journalists on the ground.
Exactly. The game has totally changed. You had independent journalists and observers there, many of them live streaming the entire event in high definition. They weren't going through some editorial filter at a legacy news desk. They just posted the raw, uncut footage immediately.
So the very record the university allegedly hoped would get buried in algorithms was instead permanently uploaded for the world to see.
It was inescapable. And it wasn't just one shaky video. The violence was recorded from, and I'm quoting here, every imaginable angle.
Wow.
You had multiple HD live streams, close-ups of fists actually connecting. You could see masked agitators clearly, mobs screaming. The sources are very clear on this point. There was no safe angle to hide behind.
So this comprehensive, unedited documentation just made any attempt at a cover-up impossible.
Completely impossible. It didn't matter what the headline said. The visual proof was overwhelming. And that's what turned this from a PR problem into a severe federal legal issue. Once federal investigators saw that footage,
They weren't acting on hearsay.
not at all. They were seeing coordinated action, physical assault, politically targeted harassment with their own eyes. It confirmed that this wasn't just some random disturbance. It was a focused attack on civil liberties. And that led, directly and very quickly, to their official intervention.
We have to focus on the one specific piece of violence that became the absolute centerpiece of this whole DOJ investigation. This is where it goes from protests to targeted assault. Can you describe the specific video that went viral?
Yes. The incident centers on a young man who was very clearly an attendee. He was wearing a Charlie Kirk Freedom shirt, so his political alignment was obvious, and he was just standing there, peacefully. He wasn't engaged in any confrontation, not provoking anyone. He was just a clear, identifiable political target.
And the attack itself, it didn't start with a punch. It started with something symbolic.
That's right. It was a highly symbolic act of theft. The first aggressor, who was masked, makes a very deliberate move and just snatches the shirt right off the victim's back.
So it's not about the fabric. It's about stripping him of his political expression.
Precisely. And the sources noted that after ripping it off, the agitator threw the shirt on the ground like a trophy. It was a performance, a signal of victory over the opposing viewpoint.
And when the victim did what anyone would do, tried to get his property back, that's when it escalated.
Immediately. As the victim bent down to retrieve his shirt, a second masked attacker rushes in, no hesitation, and just starts swinging punches.
So this was a two-stage coordinated assault.
A direct result of which was the student suffering physical injuries. It established a very clear pattern for investigators. Targeted political violence designed to suppress expression.
But what really elevated this, beyond just a physical assault, especially in the eyes of federal investigators, was what happened right after the punches were thrown. The rhetoric.
And this is the crucial context of racial harassment. The reports we read analyze the scene right after the attacks. The student is standing there, bleeding.
And what's the crowd's reaction?
Instead of anyone showing concern or calling for help, the protesters reportedly surrounded him, and they began chanting a specific racial taunt, "white boy," over and over.
As a victory cry.
Yes, the sources describe it as a victory cry. They were openly celebrating the assault while using a racialized slur.
And that combination, the assault for the political shirt, followed by the public racial taunts, that seems to be the final piece of the puzzle for the feds.
It crossed every possible line. Federal investigators aren't just looking at the act of violence itself. They're looking at the motivation, the hostile environment created by the mob, the fact that he was attacked for his shirt and then racially taunted by the crowd. It just solidified this as a serious federal matter. It screamed targeted harassment and civil rights violations. The footage made it impossible to dismiss.
The sources draw a really powerful contrast here, a then and now for Berkeley. In 1964, you have the free speech movement, students fighting for the right to speak. Now, in 2025, the picture is students needing police barricades and riot shields just to listen to a speaker.
The irony is just. It's profound. The current environment, based on these reports, is one where speech has to be physically protected by law enforcement. And the implication is pretty clear. One political faction on campus now seems willing to use physical force to silence another. It's a complete negation of the principles that Berkeley supposedly represents. A total failure to foster debate over violence.
Let's pivot to the ideological side of this, because the sources paint a really confusing picture of the protesters themselves. Even their signs were contradictory.
This is where the analysis gets really interesting and, frankly, a bit bizarre. The protest signs didn't seem to have any single coherent message. Observers on the ground described them as looking like an AI model smashed together every activism buzzword imaginable.
So not a focused protest.
Not at all. It suggests the motivation wasn't rooted in a specific political philosophy, but more of an amalgamation of generalized grievances. It seems fueled more by emotion than by any kind of logical consistency.
What were some of the specific buzzwords? Because the list is pretty telling.
It really is. The reports list this random convergence of symbols. You had BLM fists right next to Palestine flags, which were next to pride flags, which were next to feminism logos.
Okay, so a collection of progressive causes.
Yes, but then with the seemingly unrelated addition of EBT, electronic benefits transfer, just, quote, randomly slapped in the middle of the signs.
So an attempt to represent every possible progressive cause at once.
Exactly. And the analysis in the sources concludes that this was activism by emotional impulse, not by logic. When you just cram all of these sometimes contradictory messages onto one piece of cardboard, it creates what observers call a catastrophic contradiction.
It undermines the seriousness of any single cause.
It does. And you also have to remember the widespread use of masks, which in 2025 just further signals that this was premeditated and that there was an unwillingness to take any public accountability for their actions.
And the target of all this, Rob Snyder, his message makes the whole thing seem even more intellectually bankrupt.
It really does. Snyder, the comedian, was there to promote dialogue. His message was all about vulnerability, about challenging your own beliefs, using comedy to push boundaries. He was apparently very open about his own past mistakes and encouraged honest discussion.
The very definition of what a university should foster.
It is. So the violence wasn't just a rejection of him or his politics. It was a rejection of dialogue itself, a rejection of any conversation that might introduce complexity or self-doubt or humor that exposes contradictions.
So the core argument is that they used violence to stop a comedian who was promoting intellectual humility.
And the fact that the university could not protect a speaker with that message is cited as the ultimate proof that meaningful free speech, kind that requires discussing uncomfortable ideas, is, in this context at least, dead at Berkeley.
And if we needed one final, almost surreal piece of evidence of this intellectual freefall, the sources detail a subplot that is just absurd. The giant mosquito.
Ah, yes. The very expensive circus, as it was called. This might be the most bizarre and, in a way, the most illuminating detail in all the reports. Activists apparently built a massive puppet, a giant mosquito, and it was highly detailed. It had eyelashes, red high heels. This was not some quick last-minute prop.
How much effort went into this?
The sources indicate it took weeks of concerted effort and resources to build this cartoon insect.
Weeks of effort that could have gone into, I don't know, academic work or
Yes.
more focused political action. And what was the result of all this effort?
The immediate verifiable result, 4 students associated with parading this thing around were arrested for felony vandalism.
Felony vandalism for a puppet.
Yes. And it led observers to conclude that Berkeley is no longer operating as a place of serious ideas. It's become, quote, a very expensive circus. The anecdote just perfectly encapsulates this shift in priorities, where a bizarre spectacle, often leading to criminal charges, has replaced intellectual engagement.
And the sources argue that this combination, this hostility and absurdity, is actually starting to alienate students who would normally be sympathetic.
Absolutely. Think about it. Families are paying nearly $200,000 for a degree, and the environment they're paying for is defined by, well, expensive puppets and fistfights. The sources argue that the sheer absurdity and hostility is driving minds away. It's reportedly red-pilling some students, basically, pushing them toward a disillusionment with the prevailing ideologies on campus.
Now let's get into what I think is a fascinating part of the story. The internal backlash. We're so used to seeing campus activism cheered on by its base, but here the criticism came from a very unexpected place. It came from Reddit.
The Reddit reaction is a critical piece of this. The source material describes that platform as one of the most reliably left-wing platforms on the freaking planet.
So for criticism to bubble up there.
And specifically from users identified as being affiliated with Berkeley, it suggests the activists went way too far. They completely overshot the mark.
What was the nature of the complaints? What were these Berkeley Reddit users saying?
Well, these weren't outsiders. Many of these were, ultra-progressive commenters who would normally be in full solidarity with the campus protest. But the posts showed this real sense of embarrassment and fatigue. You started seeing threads where Berkeley users were actively begging the agitators to stop destroying the campus.
So it wasn't about ideology anymore. It was about basic property damage.
And reputational harm. The priority shifted from winning an ideological fight to just preserving the physical campus. It's really uncharted territory.
When Reddit becomes the voice of reason.
As the source rightly puts it, yes. When that happens, it signals a collapse of the cultural monopoly. The base, the ultra-progressive base, was reportedly stunned by the violence, the property damage, and the unhinged theatrics. It stopped being seen as legitimate resistance. It was just self-sabotage that was alienating their own community. And that internal shift is a huge indicator that the unquestioning cultural dominance on campus is starting to fracture.
And that fracture connects right back to the federal enforcement context. The timing of this DOJ intervention isn't random. It's clearly linked to the change in presidential administration.
The source material is very explicit on this point. This moment of aggressive federal intervention is seen as a direct product of the current political climate in 2025.
So they draw a sharp contrast with previous years.
A very sharp contrast. The argument is that for years, violent crackdowns on conservative campus events were routinely brushed aside as expressions of frustration. But now, the perception is that there's been a fundamental shift in priorities. The federal government is reportedly enforcing civil rights law again, specifically regarding free speech, and treating it as an active priority for the Department of Justice.
So that old strategy of just letting it blow over locally, that's gone.
It's gone. Administrators and agitators can no longer rely on that institutional protection or local sympathy. Their playbook is obsolete. It's being directly challenged by top-down federal authority. And this return to accountability is exactly why the level of fear among those being investigated is reportedly so high.
The reports also raise some very specific, concerning questions about the university's leadership, specifically the campus police chief.
Yes, that connection was highlighted as a major area of concern.
Why? What's the connection?
The source material points out that the Berkeley police chief is the same former Capitol police chief who was involved in controversial decisions back in Washington, D.C. after the 2016 political shift.
So that history raised alarm bells.
Immediately. The question critics were asking wasn't just about competence. It was about whether the decisions made that night, the failure to prevent the violence, the slowness of the intervention, were influenced by political ideology instead of standard safety protocols. especially given that the victims were conservatives.
So the federal investigation is now looking at every single decision made by high-level officials that night.
Exactly. They're dissecting it all, looking for any perceived ideological bias in how the law was enforced or not enforced. The DOJ's mandate goes way beyond the individual rioters. They're assessing the entire institutional response, including potential complicity. And that's why the consequences are so potentially catastrophic for the university's leadership.
Which brings us to the so what factor, the real-world cost of all this chaos for families across the country.
The financial burden is immense. You have parents paying, in many cases, close to $200,000 for a 4-year degree at a place like Berkeley. They're expecting a world-class educational experience.
And instead,
The sources argue they're not funding intellectual rigor, they're funding chaos, they're funding ideological indoctrination, and now they're funding the potential legal and financial risks of their children getting arrested.
even if a student sees their participation as mostly peaceful, an arrest for property destruction or assault could be ruinous.
The legal fees alone, absolutely. The entire value proposition of a prestigious degree starts to dissolve when the environment is this dysfunctional. The reports claim that families are waking up to the fact that they're not just paying for an education, they are subsidizing a hostile ideological ecosystem. And that realization is reportedly driving a huge shift in how prospective students and parents view these institutions.
They're reevaluating if it's worth the risk.
The immense financial and intellectual risk, yes.
Finally, let's detail the full scope of the consequences. The specific catastrophic fallout the university is now facing because the Department of Justice is involved. The era of just handling this internally is over.
It's completely over. And the consequences are immediate, they're multifaceted, and they are potentially existential for the university as we know it. The DOJ's involvement turns this from a bad news cycle into a full-blown legal emergency.
Yeah.
Federal investigators are now demanding everything. Every administrative order, every police report, every minute of footage related to the event and the alleged cover-up that followed.
And what's the single biggest threat? The one financial hammer blow that could cripple the entire institution.
That would be Title IV funding. The sources say it is now on the chopping block.
For our listeners who might not know, what is Title IV funding?
It's the absolute lifeblood of almost every major American university. It's the federal student aid programs. We're talking Pell Grants, subsidized student loans. If Berkeley is found negligent or complicit in civil rights violations, they could lose access to those funds.
And what would that mean, practically?
It would mean hundreds, maybe thousands of students would be unable to attend overnight. It would effectively cripple the university's enrollment and their financial operations. It is a true existential threat.
Far beyond just a monetary fine.
Oh, worlds beyond that. And on top of that massive financial risk, the sources guarantee several other outcomes are coming. Civil rights lawsuits are already being formed on behalf of the injured students. Security protocols will be completely overhauled, mandated by the federal government to ensure student safety.
And the leadership, the administrators who presided over this.
The sources are blunt. They say administrative resignations are almost guaranteed. The people responsible for safety are now facing a federal legal problem, not a PR one. Their time for offering excuses is over. The entire culture of complacency that allowed this to happen is being dismantled by federal decree.
And in a really tragic twist, this whole violent episode only serves to amplify the message of the person the memorial was for in the first place, Charlie Kirk.
The irony is just impossible to overstate. The attempt to violently shut down a dialogue has only magnified the national conversation around it. The sheer ugliness of the violence, the coordination, it forced the rest of the country to stop and ask, why? Why does a memorial for someone dedicated to free speech provoke this level of aggression?
So the strategy completely backfired.
It proved entirely counterproductive. The report suggests that the outrage from this attack has fueled a renewed energy behind TPUSA. It's empowered students who refuse to be intimidated. It made Kirk's message louder and impossible for the nation to ignore.
A complex story indeed. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for joining us.
That's all for this episode of News Focus Podcast. We'll see you next time.